organizers of East Africa Com, distinguished members of the private sector, ladies, colleagues from government, I think there are a few. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Yeah, so I'm not going to make any policy statements, but I'm just going to reassure you, because whenever people from the private sector discover that I come from government, they do what they're good at, which is to try and influence the policies, because I think they impact you. Therefore, I'll just try and give you some joy or some relief that we have been thinking very hard as a ministry about how we can be more responsive, how we can make better policies, and how we can reassure the sector that the policies of the future are going to spur the growth of your companies. So, two quotations there, one from Bill Gates, where he said that governments will always play a huge part in solving big problems. They set public policy and are uniquely able to provide the resources to make the solutions reach everyone who needs them, and so on. But then that is tempered by the comments of Noam Chomsky, and I wanted to have somebody a little bit more controversial, who said there's a tremendous gap between public opinion and public policy. So if you're one of the many people who is going to tell me at break time that what you're saying doesn't quite match what people like Brian are telling us offline, then you can remember the second quote. So I'll spend a little time on definition and the benefits of good policy. And then I'll talk about policy in the age where we are now. I think in his introduction, you can see that there's a lot of change. We said there's a meteoric rise, but that means that there's a lot of change in this environment. And sometimes, of course, policy is much slower than the changes that are taking place in the private sector and in society, and soon there's a mismatch. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and then look at some cases and the key elements of smart policy. So my definition of policy, which I just, like everybody else, picked from Wikipedia, but I chose the one from the Cambridge English Dictionary. As you can see, we were colonized by the British, as many of you were. So we do tend to be guided in many things. So a set of ideas or a plan of what to do in a particular situation that has been agreed to officially by a group of people, a business organization, a government, or a political party. So in this case, I think you're asking me about government policy, but of course we involve all these other people, such as business, citizens, and even the political class, reluctantly. Okay, so the benefits of good policy are that it gives some clarity. So you know what we're planning, you know what we believe is good for our country, and that's important in creating your strategies and plans. It also enables transparent decision-making. I never used, most of my life, I wasn't very broadly introduced, but I have about a 34-year working history, most of which was spent in academia. And when I was in academia, I had very little interest in policy. But when I came to government, that's when I realized how important policy is, and one of the main things that I think policy has value is that our decisions are not random when we have policy. It's not just based on the opinions and beliefs and desires of particular people or groups of people. We also, in Kenya, we definitely have to sell our policies because Article 10 of the Constitution requires us to have a good stakeholder consultation process for each of our policies. So it takes a long time, and sometimes it's very irritating. But at the end of it, at least we know what the citizens, what the sector feel about the policy. They've had their say, and hopefully most of them feel that they accept what we're proposing. And finally, the fact that we have policy helps us to compare what is happening with what we had proposed to happen. And so we're able to monitor, evaluate, and most importantly, to learn. However, we're in a more difficult situation now than perhaps we've been in the past. One thing is we're in the age of instant information. And this information is global, of course, because of the internet. It's easily accessible for most people, particularly educated people or people who have an income. And it's unregulated. So basically, people can say what they want, where they want, when they want to say it, and it doesn't particularly have to be accurate. Here in Kenya, we have a lot of disruptive innovation, which is changing business and the way that we do things. I always give the example about how many problems every time I lived in South Africa for a while, and every time I go back there, I find my account has been frozen because of the know your customer regulations. And they always ask me for a utility bill or something that shows my physical address. And in Kenya, that's something which is almost impossible to get because we pay everything on our phone. And the issue of the physical address doesn't come into it. So when innovation comes in, when mobile money came in, it affected the traditional banks. And for a while, until they learned how to survive in the new environment, it was very, very difficult for them. And all of us are under threat of disruptive technologies and disruptive innovations. So we have to think how to make policy in the face of this, because there's a balance. At the same time, you want to protect your traditional taxpayers who are being impacted by the disruptive technology. But at the same time, you want to encourage your disruptive technology to grow. So how do you balance the two? And then here in Kenya, we have a very assertive population. They have something to say about everything. They say it on social media. They're well educated. They're well informed. And we can no longer just be, somebody told me that if you're in government, all of us are your subjects. I think that's no longer true. We are actually the servants of our population, and we have to take into account how they feel about things. So the question in the face of this instant information, disruptive innovations, and assertive population is how can governments develop effective policies in this kind of an environment? Okay, so I guess you're more interested in telecommunications, although these days I hardly know the difference between IT and telecom. I think they're all sides of the same coin. But I often think that I can sort of divide our policies into those which are more strategic, where we're trying to do various things. Among them, I might say social engineering. And that is, we're funding capacity building and innovation. Many people talk about how much innovation there is, particularly in Nairobi, but it's also spreading to other parts of Kenya. And I keep saying, yes, but do you know how many years the government invested in education and in the expansion of higher education to create the environment where it was possible for this innovation to happen? So it didn't just happen. There's other policies, and they came from other sectors, which assisted the eventual rapid growth in innovation. So enabling new entrants to come in and to grow, dealing with very serious global challenges. I understand soon war is going to be very similar to playing on your Game Boy. And as I said, balancing between old and new businesses. And then they're what I call operational. I wasn't sure whether to call them operational or tactical policies, but you can just feel they're all lumped in together, regulating the allocation of resources, including disadvantaged groups, protecting society from the negative impacts of technology. Yeah, so that's really making sure that the technology works in the society in a good way on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so I think there are 6 elements, and I didn't get this out of the book, so you can always challenge me during the question time, which is very, deliberately making very short. Okay, so scheduling. And all of these, I'll try and go through a case to explain what I mean, so I'll try and not make it so theoretical. So is it the right time for the policy? The strategic elements, what kind of value is that policy taking? In Africa, we're so tempted just to copy whatever we call best practice. Yeah, without asking whether it's really relevant for our situation or not, and whether it's going to produce any strategic value in our environment. Then the scope of the policy, who does it cover in terms of people and businesses? The sustainability, both in terms of having the technical capacity to implement the policy and the financial and other resources to successfully implement it. And then my 2 cheeky ones. Is it a sensible policy? Yeah. Will it work? And will the target audience appreciate the policy, or will we just have a continuous push and pull because people don't like it? So let's start with the scheduling and think about the case of mobile money. Mobile money in Kenya was unregulated for a long time. Indeed, when it started to be regulated, it already had, I think, more than 10 million customers. And that was good because at that point, politically, it was impossible to kill it. So the point I'm making here is perhaps in this world where we have the instant information, the disruptive innovation, we don't want to be too quick to make policy until we understand exactly what the technology is doing in the environment a little better. Then the strategic. The case there is digital TV. Initially a very unpopular policy here in Kenya, but we had signed international agreements which required us to do it. So there's really been a balance of benefits. I don't know whether that really happened by design or by accident, but it's been very helpful because it happened just around the same time that we also had devolution. So people are seeing social benefits in terms of having lots and lots of TV stations with different language groups, different types of programming, and a huge growth in local content. So while that policy didn't start out by being very popular, I think it's ended up having benefits and having strategic benefit for the country. Then the issue of scope. I've always had a desire, I'll give you some of my histories, that I led the Directorate of E-Government before it was abolished. And we had a huge desire there to see data shared and managed in a completely different way. So when the Northern Corridor is the 4 countries, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and South Sudan, came together and talked about having a one network area in terms of communications and our data, and also just using our identity cards to cross the border without the need for a passport and so on. For me, it looked like a very exciting opportunity to push in my data sharing agenda through the back door. But what actually happened when we tried to broaden the data sharing is that we got completely stuck in the negotiations. So what unstuck, is there such a word? That process was to limit the scope and say, look, we're just talking about sharing personal data and only 8 fields that we're going to share. And those are the fields that are physically visible on your ID card, which you already present to officials. So clearly, they're not very private. And that's what moved us forward. So trying to bring everything in to the policy at the same time just didn't work and just slowed things down by a year. So I'm trying to say that many policies could probably move forward if they had an appropriate scope. Sustainability. We do have a broadband policy, and Obama is sitting there. We said Kenyans are entitled to how much bandwidth each? I thought it was the same for everyone. No? Okay.
It's called the National Broadband Strategy. If you want to know, it's on www.ca.go.ke, the Communication Authority website. By 2017, for rural is 5 megabits per second, and for urban is 20. Then the figure goes up in 2022, and eventually in 2030. Helps with your presentation.
Thank you very much, but you won't get paid. Okay, so fairly ambitious, although, you know, with broadband, it sounds very ambitious when you write it down, but because of the demands and the way they're rising, it doesn't sound very impressive within a couple of months. Yeah? Can we afford it? Yes, that's a question. So the point about sustainability, I don't need to belabor, because the resources you need to do something like that provide urban population of, they must be around 5 million with 20 Mbps, and the rural population, the other 35 million with 5 Mbps will not be cheap or easy. Sensible, okay, I hate Wi-Fi hotspots, but they're very politically popular, yeah, to roll out. But the cases where they've been rolled out, there's all kinds of challenges which are experienced, yeah. And my question always is, what exactly are you trying to achieve strategically? in the first place? And secondly, have you done a proper survey to figure out the demand? Yeah. So one case was a university town which has about, I think about 80,000 university students. So when they rolled out Wi-Fi, I mean, the demand was huge. And very soon, of course, the quality was terrible. So nobody had actually worked it out. They thought it'd be the same. There was another town that had rolled out free Wi-Fi, which is more of a business kind of town. So the demand in those two places is completely different, but nobody had sort of worked it out. Yeah, so it becomes, it's not an easy thing to do, let me put it that way. It's not an easy thing to do well, and also I always feel that it doesn't have quite the desired result. Data protection is an example of saleability. We've had a draft bill for how many years? 12, I think. 10 years, and it's just not passing. It may pass now, but it's really taken a long time to convince people and to get people to understand. So a policy will come into play much faster if people can see some benefit and some value and they can understand it. So in conclusion, smart policy making, it's a learning process. Nobody has all the answers, especially now in the knowledge age. It should be participatory, and we do try to involve business as well as citizen. It should be bold, because here we are, we're Africa, we're at the tail end right now. We want to be at the head end, at the front end very soon. And we're not going to do it by copying policies from other parts of the world. Yeah, that's what got them ahead. We need some innovation to get ahead ourselves. It should be timely, and it should be interesting and exciting.